All right, so welcome to the 2022 Markoe DePorres Annual Social Justice Lecture. My name is Dan DeLeo and I direct the Justice and Peace Studies program. I'm a Catholic moral theologian. For those of you who aren't familiar with the JPS program, you'll see on the flyers that JPS offers both a major and a minor that empower students to advance justice, peace, and environmental sustainability. We've got an interdisciplinary framework of courses that complements majors across the university, and it's designed to be flexible, so the students are able to complement their existing majors. Because our students are formed at the intersection of ethics and the social sciences, we've got alums who work in lots of different areas, gone on to law school, medical school, education, social work. And as part of the Justice and Peace Studies program, really to advance the Ignatian ideal of the faith that does justice, the Justice and Peace Studies program's founding director, Dr. Roger Bergman, began the Markoe DePorres lecture series in 1996. And his vision was to address pressing social issues, especially informed by the wisdom of the Catholic tradition. And to this end, Dr. Bergman named the series after two exemplary figures. The first is the Jesuit Father John Markoe, a former Creighton professor who started the Omaha DePorres Club in 1957 to advance racial justice. The second is St. Martin DePorres, namesake of Father Markoe's Omaha Club and patron saint of racial harmony and social justice in the Catholic tradition. The Markoe DePorres lecture has brought more than 24 distinguished thinkers to the Creighton community and addressed some of the most pressing moral issues, and this year's event follows in that precedent. Tonight's speaker will introduce and consider how Catholic social teaching understands economic justice, markets, and liberty. Although these topics are applied ethics, the Catholic Church views them as rooted in anthropology, understandings of what it means to be human. The Catholic tradition views persons as both sacred and social. Catholicism affirms that persons and groups have natural rights to goods necessary for flourishing, including to the goods of healthcare, housing, and a stable climate. The Church also insists that individuals and groups have positive duties to help others realize their rights. These duties aren't optional add-ons for absolutely free individuals who don't naturally owe anything to anyone. Rather, they're obligations rooted in the anthropology of love that declares, in the words of St. John Paul II, we are all really responsible for all. Drawing from St. Thomas Aquinas, the Church also defines justice as giving what's due. For the Catholic tradition, justice thus means safeguarding the natural rights of persons and groups. It also means ensuring that individuals and groups fulfill their natural responsibilities. Based on this framework, Catholic social teaching recognizes that free economic exchange has potential to promote human flourishing. However, more than 130 years of Catholic social teaching has consistently emphasized that neoliberal economics, rooted in individualism, self-interest, and profit, does not guarantee the protection of natural rights and fulfillment of natural duties. In the words of the U.S. Bishop's document, Economic Justice for All, the Catholic Church, quote-unquote, rejects the notion that a free market automatically produces justice. This is especially true for the poor and marginalized, those most vulnerable to violations of natural rights. Rather, and in objective contrast to libertarian thinkers like F.A. von Hayek, James Buchanan, and Charles Koch, the Church calls the state to intervene in the economy when voluntary exchanges fail to protect natural rights and ensure the fulfillment of natural duties. In the Church's political economy, then, the state is not the road to serfdom. Rather, it is the institution responsible for promoting the common good and ensuring justice for all persons. To help us better understand these concepts and their implications, I'm excited to host Dr. Anthony Annett as this year's Markoe DePorres lecturer. Dr. Annett is a Catholic economist who teaches at Fordham University. He's also a senior advisor at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Prior to his time at Fordham, Dr. Annett spent 16 years at the International Monetary Fund, where he was a speechwriter for 2 managing directors. He was also an informal consultant to the Vatican, and in 2015 co-authored the remarks delivered by Dr. Carolyn Wu, President of Catholic Relief Services, at the Vatican's launch of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. Later that year, he and I collaborated on the keynote address of Cardinal Peter Turkson, then President of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, at a Laudato Si conference at Boston College. Dr. Annett holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University. His most recent book, Cathonomics, on sale outside, applies his years of economic and theological expertise to our current signs of the times. Dr. Annett is truly a leading global expert in Catholic social teaching and economics. So to help us think more critically about Catholic social teaching, markets, and liberty, please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Annett.
Thanks so much, Dan. Is my voice carrying to the back? Yes, okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Dan, for that very warm welcome. Thanks to everybody at Creighton who have welcomed me here tonight to give this talk on my book, Cathonomics. It's kind of a strange journey for me. Somebody like me ended up here tonight talking to all of you, because I was a normal economist at the International Monetary Fund for almost 2 decades before I left to do other things. And one of the reasons why I left is because I had the realization that the way I was taught economics and the way I practiced economics was somehow flawed. It was flawed in the sense that it wasn't coherent with who we are as human beings and who we're called to be. And for that reason, I got more interested in Catholic social teaching. And so what I want to talk to you about tonight is how the principles of Catholic social teaching are actually healthier principles on which to manage the global economy than the principles that you learn in neoclassical economics, the principles that I learned in neoclassical economics. So to do that, I first of all want to present some of the main principles of Catholic social teaching. Now, given that this is a Jesuit university, I think I can go fairly quickly through these. You will all be very familiar with them, I'm sure. But that's the book Cathonomics. It's on sale outside. So these are the 10 principles of Catholic social teachings that I have distilled from a set of social encyclicals written by popes, from Pope Leo XIII in 1891, Rerum Novarum, all the way through to Pope Francis in 2020, Fratelli Tutti. And I think you can distill 10, I can distill 10 principles. 10 is a nice round biblical number. Maybe you can come up with 11 if you want, but I came up with 10. And they're the common good, integral human development, integral ecology, solidarity, subsidiarity, reciprocity and gratuitousness, the universal destination of goods, the preferential option for the poor, then Catholic notions of rights and duties, and, as Dan mentioned, Catholic notions of justice. So what I want to do is I want to talk about each of these principles very quickly, separately, and then let's stack them up against the principles in neoclassical economics, and you can assess yourself what sounds healthier to you. Let's start with the very basic principle of the common good. The common good is the sum of those conditions of the social life which allows social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. This is a sense of interfused well-being. You want to will the well-being of the other person for the other person's sake, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And you want to make sure that the institutions allow each person to reach his or her fulfillment, to become who God intends them to be. It's the good in and through which every human being can flourish. Now, you need the material basis of human flourishing. This is why economics comes into it. This is why economics is central. You need things like security. You need access to housing, healthcare, food, education. You need opportunities for decent and rewarding work. You need a sustainable environment. You need all of these things to be a fully functional, flourishing, fulfilled human being. That's the common good. And the common good, Pope Francis says, is the central principle of Christian social ethics. As we will see in a few minutes, there's no sense of the common good in neoclassical economics. The second principle is called integral human development. And with apologies for the non-inclusive language, this is from 1967, Pope Paul VI calls it the development of each man and the whole man. Or as I would say today, the development of each person and the whole person. This means the fullest development of each person's potential to become the best version of yourselves. If you've studied any Aristotle, you should see immediately that this will resonate with you. So you want to develop across all dimensions of life, not just the economic and the material dimension, but social, political, psychological, emotional, cultural, and spiritual too. You want to become a fully developed human being in all of your fully fledged nature. It's not about having more, it's about being more. Now you'll see again, neoclassical economics, it's all about having more, it says nothing about being more. That's one integral. The second integral is integral ecology. This is the newest principle of Catholic social teaching. It comes from Pope Francis, his encyclical in 2015, Laudato Si. And this basically says, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and in constant interaction with it. So therefore, he goes on to say, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. In other words, as Pope Francis says, how we treat nature affects how we treat human beings because they're so deeply interconnected. We want to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Again, neoclassical economics has no such principle. The fourth principle, number 4, is solidarity. This is kind of what I call the superhighway to the common good. It's how you attain the common good. Solidarity, as defined by Pope John Paul II, says it's a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, the good of all and of each individual because, as Dan said, we are all really responsible for all. This notion that we are all responsible for all is the essence of solidarity. It's a moral response to our basic interdependence of human life. And in a world of globalization, there is such a thing as a universal common good, and there is such a thing as global solidarity. Pope Francis often talks about the globalization of indifference. We need the globalization of solidarity to counteract this globalization of indifference. I'm going quickly here because I know you're all good Jesuit students who know these principles very well. Subsidiarity is probably the most complicated and probably the most misunderstood principle of Catholic social teaching. Libertarians will tell you that subsidiarity means small government. It means federalism. That's actually not what subsidiarity says. Subsidiarity says decisions should be taken at the lowest level possible, but the highest level necessary. And sometimes that high level is actually the global level, as would say climate change, where problems are global. So in other words, higher level communities should assist lower level communities, should help them, but not usurp their rightful authority. And again, this quote I put up there is from Pope Pius XI in his 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, where he gives a definition of subsidiarity. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just the last couple of lines there. You need to help. The key word there is help. Subsidium is the Latin for help. Help the members of the body social and never destroy or absorb them. And for Pope Francis, subsidiarity demands a greater sense of responsibility, a greater help from those with greater power. It's like the Spider-Man principle. With great power comes great responsibility. Think of it like that. That's subsidiarity. Number 6 is kind of a twin one, reciprocity and gratuitousness. Gratuitousness, as defined by Pope Francis, is the ability to do some things simply because they are good in themselves, without concern for personal gain or recompense. This is a human level principle. You want to do something to will the good of the other person on the other side of the economic transaction. If you're in the market with somebody, this says you should not be out just to maximize your own profit. You should not be out for self-interest. You should be out to will the good of the other person, to give the other person a benefit. This goes against Adam Smith. This goes against libertarianism. This goes against neoclassical economics. But it's not just wishy-washy. It's not just in the clouds. This says if you can build a deeper relationship between people, you increase the chances that any benefit you give will be returned, and you get greater social trust, and you develop a healthier and more prosperous economy that way. And again, that's reciprocity and gratuitousness. Number 7, and I promise you we'll get to 10 very soon. Number 7 is the universal destination of goods. Again, this definition is taken from Gaudium et Spes, which is a Vatican II document. And this says, again, with apologies for the unfortunate non-inclusive language, man should regard the external things that he legitimately possesses not only as his own, but also as common, in the sense that they should be able to benefit not only him, but also others. In other words, the goods of the earth are destined for all people, without exclusion, without exception. So private property in Catholic social teaching is valid. It's not communist. There's no role for abolition of private property. But there's a huge, huge but next to that endorsement of private property. And that says, in the words of Pope John Paul II, that private property always comes with a social mortgage. And that social mortgage means you need to use your wealth to meet the needs of every single suffering human person. Pope Francis says the right to private property is actually a secondary right, not a primary right. It's a secondary right. Now, obviously, libertarians would have a very, very different view of private property than that. But this is Catholic social teaching at its essence. Number 8 is very much related to the universal destination of goods, and this is the preferential option for the poor. This is the notion that in our tradition, God identified with the poor, in whose faces we are called upon to see Christ, in the faces of the poor. So all human action, all human policy should be judged in terms, first and foremost, of how it affects the poor. And Pope Francis talks a lot about the throwaway culture, how the poor are simply discarded, excluded from society. And when we talk about neoliberalism, we can talk about, in very practical terms, how the poor tend to be excluded from policies and from the economy and from society. And that's just a long quote there, which I won't read. It's from Pope John Paul II. It's a special form of primacy in the exercise of Christian charity, to which the whole tradition of the Church bears witness. This is a central principle of Catholic social teaching. It's right up there with universal destination of goods. Let's talk about rights and duties. What is a right? Well, a right, any philosopher will tell you, is a moral claim that others are obliged to accept. You have political rights, such as the right to free speech, the right to vote, the right to assembly, and you have economic rights, the rights to economic security. Now, the Catholic Church came a bit late in the day to the idea of human rights. But when it did come to the human rights, especially with Pope John the 23rd in the 1960s, I would argue that it had the intellectual apparatus to make the shift. And that apparatus is the emphasis on human dignity and the common good. So for Catholic social teaching, rights are, first of all, our economic rights. If you look at Pope John XXIII's encyclical Parliamentaris, the first rights he mentioned, and I've written them here, are economic rights. The very first rights. Before any political rights come economic rights. Man, and again apologies for the non-inclusive language, this is becoming a habit I'm afraid. Man has the right to live, he has the right to bodily integrity and to the means necessary for the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally the necessary social services. In consequence, he has the right to be looked after in the event of ill health, disability stemming from his work, widowhood, old age, enforced unemployment, or whenever through no fault of his own he is deprived of the means of livelihood. So economic rights are central, they're always linked to the common good, and they're always tied to duties. If you have a right, that means you also have a corresponding duty. Again, that will differ very strongly from how libertarians view rights. They really tend to downplay the notion of duties. Finally, Catholic notions of justice. Justice is giving others their due, giving them what is owed to them. For Thomas Aquinas, this was a cardinal virtue. Catholic social teaching sees three kinds of justice. Commutative justice is the justice between two individuals. Think of contracts, promises, agreements. Libertarians have no problem with that. Distributive justice is what the community owes the individual, how the fruits of the earth and economic activity are to be properly apportioned. Libertarians would have a big problem with that. And then there's contributive justice, what the individual owes the community. Voting, participation in economic and civic life, paying your taxes, leaving the environment in a good shape to the next generation, all parts of contributive justice. So, I've distilled those 10 principles of Catholic social teaching from 130 years of papal encyclicals, all the way from Pope Leo XIII through to Pope Francis. Second thing I want to do in this talk is to stack that up against the principles of neoclassical economics. First of all, I'll start with here. With the Enlightenment paradigm out of which neoclassical economics comes, we need to understand three core shifts. The shift from the common good to the autonomous individual. No sense of us being social animals with interfused well-being, in the sense like we're just autonomous individuals floating out there, doing our own thing, maximizing our own well-being. And this can be traced back to philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Second is the shift from balance and moderation to mastery and maximization. So in traditional terms, you would condemn greed, you would know when enough was enough, and you would focus on what was truly good for the human being, finding the right balance in all our areas of life. Now, it became about, let's use science to gain control over the natural world, what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, and a move towards limitless economic growth. The third shift is what used to be vices are now regarded as virtues. And the classic one there is greed. You have insatiable appetites for what the historian David Wooten calls the insatiable passions for power, for profit, and for pleasure without limit and without end. And this gives rise to Adam Smith's idea that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. This is the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, talking about what leads to, he doesn't use the term common good, but his idea of the common good is where everybody is motivated by self-interest, combined with the invisible hand of the market, which will lead to rising wealth in society. That's how you create wealth. Self-interest plus the market. Now, this is the core of what I want to talk to you tonight. I want to stack up the principles of neoclassical economics that comes out of that Adam Smith world, that comes out in some sense out of utilitarianism too, against the principles of Catholic social teaching. The first one is the understanding of the person. We've talked about that. For neoclassical economics, it's autonomous individuals. But for Catholic social teaching, we are beings in relation. Aristotle talked about we are social animals, zoon politikon. But in a sense, Christianity takes this one level higher, that we are relational beings. We mirror the life of the Trinity, which is a life of pure relationality and pure love. That matters for everything else that follows. The motivation of the person, well, we already saw that from Adam Smith, which is self-interest. But from Catholic social teaching, we have solidarity, we have reciprocity, we have gratuitousness. Now you might say, isn't this naive? Wasn't Smith talking about how human beings actually are, how they actually function in the world, as opposed to these kind of airy-fairy principles of Catholic social teaching? No, I think Smith missed something important. He was concerned when he was writing his book in the 1770s about corruption and cronyism in the world in which he lived. So he thought that if you could abolish this kind of corruption and cronyism by having take the personal relationship out of economic transactions. So you only have an impersonal marketplace where only self-interest reigned. But I think he threw the baby out with the bathwater, because these principles of Catholic social teaching, as I've already suggested, can actually provide salt to the economic life. They can make something more flavorful. They can create trust. They can actually create prosperity. Not like, as opposed to what Smith said, it's all just about self-interest. So keep that in mind, because I actually think, because these principles are not just in the domain of wishful thinking, they actually have very practical relevance for how you structure the economy. The good of the person. Now we're getting deep into neoclassical economics. Any of you who have studied economics, microeconomics, will have learned that the goal of the person is to maximize subjective material preferences. You might not have come across that particular term. You might have come across it as instead maximize utility subject to your budget constraint. But you're talking about what they call homo economicus, rational economic man, maximizing your utility function. You have preferences, you like what you like, and you try to satisfy those preferences to the best extent possible, usually bundles of goods and services you can buy on the market. And that's what rationality means for neoclassical economics. Consume as much as you can in line with your preferences, given the money you have. Economists don't really interrogate the full implications of this assumption. And I think if you do interrogate it, you'll come across some pretty dubious implications. One is you're actually baking in Adam Smith's sense of self-interest. Your utility function is what you like. It's what gives me satisfaction. It's what maximizes my utility. Not your utility, my utility. The second implication is preferences are subjective. You like what you like, and nobody can tell you otherwise. Nobody is allowed to criticize your choices over what to consume. anything that is legal can be a valid preference according to neoclassical economics. Whether it contributes to integral human development or human flourishing or common good, all of that is beside the point. You like what you like. The third implication of this is that what really matters, what only matters, is goods and services you can buy on the market. This is how you measure whether your preferences are satisfied or not, by what you buy on the market. Economists call it revealed preference. You might have seen that in microeconomics. There's certainly no notion of the wider domain of integral human development, or of being rather than having. Here it's all having as much as you can for the money you have. The fourth implication is that your wants are unbounded. All that stops you from consuming more is your income. This gives rise to the idea that more economic growth is always to be preferred to less. And remember, integral human development is a much deeper and more profound notion than GDP. It's funny because in the Christian tradition, we have the idea that your desires should be bounded, your needs should be limited, and lower goods, like goods that you buy in the market, should always be subordinated to higher goods. There should be an idea of what is good for society. And in fact, as a guy called Brad Gregory puts it, you no longer have a good society, you have a goods society. Consumerism rules. This is a recipe for consumerism. Just a quick detour on rationality. You know, economists will say that neoclassical economics is a science. It's a science because it's based on the assumption of rationality. And here, what all that means in this sense is that you're trying to satisfy your preferences in a coherent and consistent manner, but you're still satisfying your preferences. In the tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas and Catholic social teaching, rationality means something very, very different. It's about the deployment of the virtue of prudence to figure out what is good and then to actively choose what is good for your life and for the life of other people. That's what rationality means in the Catholic tradition. It's a very, very different notion of rationality from neoclassical economics. Okay, what about the good of society? Well, we know what the good of society is for Catholic social teaching. It's the common good. We know what the common good is, this sense of interfused well-being. But for neoclassical economics, it just means adding up the satisfaction of your subjective material preferences. And the way we normally do that is we add up the consumption of all market goods and services in the society, which some of you will recognize is the very definition of GDP, gross domestic product. And as with any additive standard where you add up, people can be zeroed out. You can zero out people. Somebody can have absolutely nothing. Somebody could have 0 and somebody can have 100, and your total is still 100. You don't account for the fact that you have zeroed somebody out. But that's the problem with an additive, an aggregative way of looking at preference satisfaction, as opposed to the common good, which is much more geometric in structure, that if one person is a 0, then in a sense the whole thing, whole product is a 0. Market functioning, well, we know from neoclassical economics it's competition. For Catholic social teaching, it doesn't reject competition entirely. There's no support for statist central planning, but competition must be subordinated to cooperation and virtues like solidarity, reciprocity, and gratuitousness. What about the standard of judgment? Well, here, The standard of judgment for neoclassical economics is called Pareto efficiency. Now, any of you who've done economics will know what this means. It's the point at which you maximize the satisfaction of your preferences. A market trade will always take place as long as it benefits both sides. Pareto efficiency is the point at which all voluntary trades that can benefit both people are exhausted, so you can't make somebody else better off without making somebody, at least one other person, worse off. That's Pareto efficiency. And that is the gold standard of neoclassical economics. This is not compatible with the standard of judgment under Catholic social teaching, which is rather universal destination of goods and the preferential option for the poor. Why is that? Because Pareto efficiency, by definition, rules out all issues of distribution and redistribution. It is compatible with enormous amounts of inequality in income and wealth. You simply cannot take $1 from a billionaire to give it to a homeless person, because the billionaire is worse off by $1. That is not a Pareto efficient transfer, because you're making somebody worse off. So in a sense, all distribution is ruled out. Now, to be fair to neoclassical economists, they don't necessarily argue that redistribution is wrong. They will simply argue that it belongs to the domain of politics, not economics. It's outside of economics. Whereas in Catholic social teaching, ethics is always within economics. So that's the standard of judgment. What about the understanding of rights? Well, in neoclassical economics, rights, the only rights that really matter are property rights, because you need property rights to make markets work. If you can't allocate who owns what in the market, then markets will just completely break down. And that's why neoclassical economics is often allied with libertarianism, even though it comes out of a somewhat different tradition, because of this emphasis on property rights. But as we noticed, as we already talked about, Catholic social teaching, its main emphasis, it doesn't deny property rights, but it subordinates property rights to the universal destination of goods, and it emphasizes economic rights. And we've already talked about some of those economic rights: food, shelter, healthcare, education, just wages, social protection. Neoclassical economics says that some of these goods should be purchased on the market, and those that don't belong to politics. Either way, it's not an issue that economics needs to worry too much about. What about norms of justice? Again, neoclassical economics, there's only one norm, and that's commutative justice, the justice of contracts and agreements. There is no role for distributive justice, what the community owes the individual, because you're not owed anything that the market can't provide. And there's no role either for contributive justice, what you owe the community, because it's all about self-interest and maximizing your advantage, not fulfilling your duty. There are neoclassical economics has no notion of duties. We're getting close to the end of this big table, so bear with me. The role of government. For neoclassical economics, the role of government is strictly limited. Like libertarianism, it sees a role for government as being a neutral referee, enforcing property rights, making sure the market functions. But to be fair, it does allow governments to go a bit further. When markets are deemed to be inefficient, as with, say, public goods, or with externalities like pollution, then it allows the government might have a role to step in and fix the inefficiency. But that's still a very limited role. For Catholic social teaching instead, the roles are defined by the two principles of solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity says the government must guarantee the provision of goods necessary for integral human development and the common good. Those are the goods that are listed under the banner of economic right. We've already mentioned them. There is an understanding that many human needs cannot be met by the market, should not be met by the market, and there's always a special responsibility to aid and care for the poor. You must guarantee the goods, that goods are provided. Doesn't necessarily have to provide the goods itself, the government, but it must guarantee that they're provided. So that's the role of the government under the banner of solidarity. Under the banner of subsidiarity, the state is called, remember subsidiarity is about helping. So the state is called to regulate the market, to align it with the common good. What Pope Pius calls directing, stimulating, coordinating, supplying, and integrating. Now this should tell you alone that subsidiarity is not compatible with libertarianism, because a libertarian would not accept any of those roles for the government. So subsidiarity and solidarity are the two principles that define what the government is called to do under Catholic social teaching. And by the way, under Catholic social teaching, Pope John the 23rd says the role of the state is the common good, is to support the common good. So it couldn't be clearer than that. Finally, the treatment of nature. Well, in neoclassical economics, it's extractive. Remember, you have this assumption that leads to limitless economic growth, and which gives rise to an extractivist mentality in the service of this GDP growth. There's no such thing as integral ecology. And that would be the treatment of nature under neoclassical economics versus Catholic social teaching. So that's the crux of where I want to go tonight in terms of Catholic social teaching principles and neoclassical economics principles. Now let's ask the question though, what's healthier? What's better? What's more realistic? So in the book, I look at this through a number of different lenses. I look at evidence from economic games, evidence from evolutionary biology, from neuroscience, from happiness studies, and from psychology. Very quickly, I'll summarize the evidence from each of these areas. Economic games is when you put people together in a laboratory setting and ask them to play a game such as dividing a pot of money between them or something like that. It turns out that when people play these games together, they don't behave like Homo economicus. They demonstrate traits of altruism, fairness, and reciprocity. They are willing to cooperate for the greater good. They are willing to share fairly. And they hate unfairness. They hate being cheated. Evidence from evolution, well, every evolutionary biologist will tell you that we are wired to cooperate, not only to seek our own gain, but to help people in need and strive for justice. There are quite a number of different theories in evolution as to why these traits developed, but there's no fundamental disagreement among evolutionary biologists about this. That's evolutionary biology. Neuroscience. This is what happens in the brain. We are quite literally wired to cooperate, according to neurosciences. You have two parts of the brain, the limbic system, the old system, the ancient system which regulates emotion, and the prefrontal cortex which regulates the higher level executive function. And it's this prefrontal cortex which allows our rational nature to take pride of place and to help us choose pro-social behavior, to help us choose how to actually put petty grievances aside and to cooperate with other people. It's funny because there's an ancient understanding from Aristotle that the soul is divided into a rational and a non-rational component. Aristotle said that 2,500 years ago, modern neuroscience says something actually pretty similar. And again, this is very different from rationality of neoclassical economics, which is actually all about people acting on their desires, which is actually the opposite of rationality in this older way of thinking. Then there's the happiness studies, which I also talk about. This is the field of subjective well-being. You simply ask people, how do you evaluate your life today? How do you evaluate your life on a scale of 1 to 10? And then you look at these answers and you try to figure out what causes happiness and unhappiness. What we learn is that what matters for happiness is not so much money and wealth and stuff, but it's actually things like good quality relationships, friendships, a sense of meaning and purpose in life, a sense of social trust in society. It turns out that the happiest countries in the world are the Scandinavian countries, the social democratic countries. So they're obviously doing something right, I would argue. And psychology, again, the field of positive psychology argues that such factors as engagement, quality relationships, meaning and purpose, accomplishments and achievements, this is what matters. Now, if that rings a bell, that should sound a lot like integral human development, becoming fully flourishing human beings in all dimensions of life. So again, I would argue that from all these areas of science, all the scientific evidence, that the principles of Catholic social teaching are actually more in accord with human nature than the principles of neoclassical economics. The principles of neoclassical economics are actually weird. They're kind of bizarre. They create this fictitious human being that has very little bearing with how human beings actually are in the real world. So to sum up, what does this evidence show? It shows that we are not merely self-interested, but we care about the well-being of the others. There is indeed such a thing as the common good. Our interactions are not just about competition. We are wired for cooperation. Happiness is less in line with maximizing our own pleasure and more in line with a more fuller sense of human flourishing or integral human development. And we are wired for fairness, and we take great exception to cheating and any distribution which is deemed unjust. We do not evaluate market transactions in line with Homo economicus or neoclassical economics. Okay, I finished that part. The final part of what I want to talk to you before we open it up for a discussion is what Catholic tradition says explicitly about libertarianism and neoliberalism. The first point to note is that libertarianism and neoliberalism are actually quite different. They're not the same. Libertarianism is predicated on self-ownership, and its highest value is freedom. Neoliberalism is predicated on free market competition, and its highest value is efficiency, Pareto efficiency, what we just talked about. Libertarianism has its roots in the philosophy of John Locke, which says that a person is entitled to what she produces when mixed with her own labor, given that she owns herself and her own labor. So, as I said, it prizes freedom above all else. So, libertarians like, for example, Robert Nozick, would argue that the government might have a role with providing a common defense, keeping people safe, physically safe, but no other role. Everything else is coercion. And coercion is bad, obviously. In its most extreme form, libertarianism even argues that taxation and economic regulation are forms of oppression and violence. It's actually a utopian vision. Nozick's book is actually called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And it's utopian because Nozick envisioned a collection of voluntary communities, each choosing their own ends with no form of government interference in what they do. So if you want to set up a Marxist collective, Nozick would say, be my guest, do it. It's just that the government cannot get involved and cannot coerce anybody. That's very different from the common good. And this is, libertarianism actually denies the common good. This is Pope Francis, who argues that libertarian individualism denies the validity of the common good because on one hand it supposes that the very idea of common implies the constriction of at least some individuals. There's your Nozick's coercion. And the other, that the notion of good deprives freedom of its essence. If you have an objective idea of the good, then you're not really free to choose. You should be free to choose whatever you like, as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. That's libertarianism. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, let me just see what's next. Okay. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, comes out of the tradition of neoclassical economics, what I just talked about. It argues that the general welfare is maximized when economic efficiency is prioritized. This gives rise to high economic growth, which trickles down to benefit everyone and is best achieved by free market competition. So, as I mentioned, just like libertarianism, it sees a strictly limited role for government. It allows the government to do some things the private sector can't, but it's a very, very limited role. On the whole, it calls for things like deregulation, privatization, low taxes, a very, very limited welfare state, the free movement of capital, and a flexible labor market. And by the way, if you ever hear economists using the term flexible labor market, it means they're opposed to things like minimum wages and unions, because they interfere with the free market for labor. Okay, so while Catholic social teaching criticizes both, the criticisms are actually different. The criticism of libertarianism is more anthropological. It is not in accord with who we are as human beings. While the criticism of neoliberalism is more practical, it just leads to bad outcomes, which I think is true. Because remember, and again, Pope Francis says that libertarianism is fundamentally opposed to the common good. Another issue, another problem with libertarianism goes back to our old friend, the universal destination of goods. Remember, in Catholic social teaching, quoting, going back to Thomas Aquinas and even further, property has a twofold character: private ownership and common use. And it is the common use part that gives rise to the principle of the universal destinations of good, which, by the way, is anathema to libertarians. This gives rise to what Pope Pius XI, writing in 1931, called the twin rocks of shipwreck. The twin rocks of shipwreck are when you take either private ownership or common use and push them to the extreme. You run into problems with the twin rocks of shipwreck when you push private ownership too far or when you push common use too far. This is what Pius said. Accordingly, twin rocks of shipwreck must be carefully avoided. For as one is wrecked upon, or comes close to, what is known as individualism, this is libertarianism, by denying or minimizing the social and public character of the right of property, and by rejecting or minimizing the private and individual character of this same right when inevitably runs into collectivism. That, by the way, is communism, this collective ownership of the means of production. So these are the twin rocks of shipwreck. On one hand, kind of communist collectivism, and on the other hand, extreme versions of free market libertarianism. Both are regarded as the twin rocks of shipwreck. Both are rocks of shipwreck. both are very vociferously condemned by Catholic social teaching. It's really hard to defend either communism or libertarianism with Catholicism. Very, very hard to do. This is a very long quote from that same encyclical by Pope Pius XI. And it goes to show he is condemning the notion that free market competition should govern economic life. I'll read a little bit of it because I think it's important, and even though it was written in 1931, it speaks very clearly to us today. The right ordering of economic life cannot be left to a free competition of forces. For from this source, as from a poisoned spring, have originated and spread all the errors of individualist economic thinking. And it goes on condemning, competition. And the final line, I'll just skip to the final line. We won't bother reading the whole thing, it's too long. Therefore, it is most necessary that economic life be again subjected to and governed by a true and effective directing principle. There is your argument from Catholic social teaching against libertarianism, against extreme versions of laissez-faire economics, against extreme versions of free market ideology. Now, this theme has reverberated down through the years throughout Catholic social teaching. You'll see it in all popes. I don't have time to go into great detail, but you can certainly see it in Pope Paul VI in the 1960s. You can see it in Pope John Paul II, who talked about the idolatry of the market. And you can see it very clearly in Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis has often condemned free market ideology, what he calls the deified market, or the magical conception of the market. So against Adam Smith, he rejects the notion that self-interest serves the common good, seeing only what he calls a seedbed for collective selfishness. So for Pope Francis then, the problem is not just anthropological in the sense that it's against human nature, it's also very practical. Neoliberalism leads to very bad economic outcomes, namely that the poor and the excluded get left behind. They are not even considered part of society. That's his diagnosis of the throwaway culture. He vociferously condemns neoliberalism. He condemns here people who continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, and he's right about that, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. A very strong indictment there of neoliberalism. In Fratelli Tutti, in 2020, Pope Francis also condemns neoliberalism, this time by name. The marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem, however much we ask to believe this dogma of neoliberal faith. Whatever the challenge, this impoverished and repetitive school of thought always offers the same recipes. Neoliberalism simply reproduces itself by resorting to the magical theories of spillover or trickle, without using the name, as the only solution to societal problems. There is little appreciation of the fact that the alleged spillover does not resolve the inequality that gives rise to new forms of violence threatening the fabric of society. So the indictment here is less anthropological and more practical. Pope Francis is saying it's rewarding the powerful and the privileged while sending the poor away empty. Exactly the opposite of what Christianity is supposed to be all about. It fails the test of the universal destination of goods it destroys justice and solidarity, or in the words of Pope Francis, and I'm going to conclude on this one, Pope Francis says, such an economy excludes, such an economy kills, such an economy destroys Mother Earth. And I can't think of a better way to end than on those prophetic words of Pope Francis. So once again, thank you for bearing with me through the past hour. We've been through a lot. I've just given you a very cursory view of what's in the book. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience in listening to me. And now we will open for questions. Okay?
Where's the back, or is this still no? No? All right. I'm not even going to try. So we've heard a lot. We've heard a lot in terms of anthropology. We've heard a lot in terms of application. We've heard a lot in terms of overlaps and potentially dissidences between philosophies and the mission, the theology that informs a place like Creighton. So we'll open it up to questions, giving priority and preferences to students. I guess without a microphone, I'll just call on people as if we're in a giant lecture hall. Asking if there are any clarifying questions, concepts that aren't clear, things that Dr. Annette mentioned that you're not quite certain about in terms of new terms, new concepts, or maybe things that you've heard before but are understanding maybe in a different way. So are there any clarifying questions, especially from students, in terms of the content that you heard from Dr. Annette tonight? Parker?
You talked about the use of GDP as a measure, and I kind of got lost in that portion of the lecture. Can you describe what Catholic social teaching would, can you just elaborate on your thoughts on that, as well as Catholic social teaching as GDP as a measure, and if we should even be using it at all?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good question. GDP has a certain level of importance. It measures something very real. It measures the consumption and production of all market goods and services in society. The problem is, though, that that's not the same thing as the common good. GDP can leave a lot of people out. It can exclude a lot of people, which is the main reason why it's not really compatible with the common good. So we need to also look at distributional measures. There are also other reasons why GDP can be flawed. It measures things that do harm to the environment. It doesn't measure things that are socially valuable, like care work. So there's a whole literature on why GDP needs to be reformed. But given I don't have much time to get into that, so I'll just say that it serves a purpose, but a fairly restricted purpose. Yeah.
I really thought the idea of like the twin rocks of shipwreck was interesting, like a really good analogy, I suppose.
Yeah.
I don't really know what else to say, but
Yeah.
What about others? What does this raise for you? What do you like?
So like a lot of what you're talking about is more like on the society level and the structure. What does that mean for like the individual while we're like waiting for that kind of change?
That's a good question. And Pope Francis talks a lot about individual virtue as well as social virtue. But I think that getting back to the essence of who we are as human beings, the idea that you should not be motivated by greed, that there are natural limits to your wants and desires, that you should have an objective version of the good, that it should be more about being more than having more. These are all capacities to be developed at the level of the individual. There's also, we didn't talk about climate change today, but Dan knows a lot about climate change. But in Laudato Si, Pope Francis calls for ecological virtues, good habits that train you to act as good environmental stewards and ecological citizens. So yeah, there's plenty you can do at the individual level. But you also need societal change. You also need institutional change. And that's a problem when you play one thing off against the other. You need both. Yeah.
Thank you very much, that was excellent. How do Catholics, like at the Napa Institute, for instance, defend a market economy utilizing Catholic social teaching? Where's the disconnect that you would see between Catholics who espouse that type of market economy versus Catholic social teaching and attempting to integrate those two? What's going on there?
I think that's a very hard thing to do. It's very, very hard to kind of integrate something that the Napa Institute tries to do with Catholic social teaching. I guess to be as fair as possible, I mean, there is an argument to be made that within limits, market economies can lead to higher prosperity. And the example I will give is China. In 1980, China had 80% of China's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, China has eliminated extreme poverty. It's zero. And that's because China went from a completely closed, state-run, collectivist society to something more market-oriented. They did not go in the neoliberal, the libertarian direction. China is very state-driven. 50% of China's industries are owned by the state. So it's very state-directed. It's not like Western capitalism, but it does rely on markets. So you can say that, you know, within certain limits, markets can create prosperity. The problem is they cannot distribute prosperity properly. Whereas I think it's fair to say that markets can produce wealth, but they can't distribute wealth without governments, and they can't produce greater senses of well-being, which go beyond wealth, let's say. So to be fair to the people who claim that, you know, the market economy has certain virtues, there is something to concede to that argument, yes.
Not necessarily about the lecture, but historically has, like the Catholic tradition, has there been any bias towards like free market or a state-driven market? Has during like at least recent history, has there been any bias, or has it always fairly been highest possible, or highest necessarily lowest possible? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's actually been very consistent since Rerum Novarum in 1891. There's a very consistent argument that the market is acceptable, but it has to be within a moral boundary. And that, you know, different popes would look at that from different perspectives, responding to various different challenges at various different times of history. But the idea that the market economy needs to have a moral boundary, needs to respect the universal destination of goods, is a consistent thread through Catholic social teaching, yeah.
What about things that maybe made you uncomfortable? What are you not so sure about, or what might you disagree with in terms of concepts that you've heard here that maybe you've heard in other spaces, other classes, other readings? What aren't you so sure about tonight? Or what discomforts are you sitting with right now?
You talked about the goods of society, or the goods for society, who gets to decide those goods, and how you...
Sorry, I'm not hearing.
Okay. You talked about the goods of for society, who gets to choose those goods, and how do you address like, the danger of
Paternalism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think you do that by respecting the principle of subsidiarity, that the role of higher level communities like the state is to help lower level communities like families or small businesses or unions or other communities, but not to usurp their rightful authority. So yeah, I mean, Pope John Paul II was very worried. He raised concerns that it's possible that the welfare state, for example, could lead to attitudes of paternalism. which would not respect subsidiarity. But that can be fixed through proper mechanism design, yeah.
Alright, this isn't an uncertainty. I just have a question for you. So you, as mentioned before, you worked for like a large like bank corporation. I'm just wondering like where like you kind of had like that moment of realization that the economy like does exploit people, and like how you came to terms with that and what made you leave that job.
Yeah, this is a story I've told many times, so apologies to anybody who's heard this already. For me, this started with the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. Whereas to me, immediately I thought that this is a crisis of morality, of ethics, of greed, whereas most economists looked at it as a technical crisis that needed technical fix. There was no moral dimension to it whatsoever. And I started to feel quite uncomfortable with that, to be honest. And, you know, and then I started to realize that, you know, a lot of how we do economics has adverse implications on people's lives. And this is a problem. So I started researching and looking more into the Catholic social tradition, which brings me to where I am today. But it all started for me with the global financial crisis in 2008-2009. Yeah.
Henry?
Yeah, I think that Catholic social teaching does a really good job kind of speaking to the totality and the differences of the human experience. But how do you structure a global economic system around something like that? How did how could it possibly, without being a totalitarian welfare state, take care of everybody?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, in the book I go through a lot of very practical proposals. I want to take it not just at the level of abstract principles, but actually what does this mean in terms of how you structure the economy. So I think that, you know, obviously there's a role for the state, and I make no apologies for that in providing basic goods for human flourishing. But also, you want to, based on subsidiarity, you want to do things like support unions. Let unions bargain themselves without state interference, but give them the power to do that. You also want to support things like they have in Germany, democracy in the workplace, co-determination, whereby you have workers sitting on boards of directors, where you have workers sitting on work councils at the level of the actual corporation, at the enterprise, where they take decisions on how, and management. It's called co-management or co-determination. So there are plenty of practical principles that respect subsidiarity, which allow kind of people to kind of flourish in a more holistic sense without necessarily the government kind of stepping in and subsuming their agency. So many ways to do that, yeah.
Well, one thing that we talk about in classes is that all of this is abstract and theoretical until it's not. And it becomes not pretty quickly for a lot of people. So my hope tonight as we wrap up is that you've learned something that you can take with you. Something that's new, something that confirms, something that you walked in here with, maybe a new idea or a concept that challenged you. So for all of those things that Dr. Nett has equipped us with, please join me in thanking him.